Hello, thank you for joining me today. My name is Elizabeth Paravicini Gibert, and I am a member of the Department of Hispanic Studies and the program in Environmental Studies at Vassar. I work in the field of the environmental humanities, especially in a subset of the environmental humanities called post-colonial ecologies, where we look at the impact of colonization on the societies that we examine. My area of research is in the Caribbean, so I look at environmental issues in the Caribbean. Most recently, my project involves a look at how the societies of the Caribbean are looking at climate change and its impacts on the various populations, particularly coastal areas, and in particular, the large cities along the Caribbean that are dealing with issues like rising sea levels, rising sea temperatures, rising air temperature, and increasing flooding on coastal environments. I want to talk to you today about the Dominican Republic, which is one of the cities that are endangered by climate change in the region. The first description of the port of Santo Domingo, the present day capital of the Dominican Republic, predates the city's foundation and comes from Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo's Natural and General History of the Indies, written between 1526 and 1548. The site of a small Taino village, it lured the struggling and starving conquistadors through the promise of gold. The Spaniards would soon take control and build a city cocoon between the Ozama and Isabela rivers, with the mouth of the Ozama becoming the city's bustling port. Within a few years, it would absorb the Taino village that had offered the starving Spaniards shelter, its members vanishing into absorption or exile, and the beautiful site would become known as the first seat of European colonial rule in the New World and its first official port, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the Americas, and the destination for the first shipment of African slaves to the New World. Now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, colonial Santo Domingo is currently the largest city in the Caribbean by population, with some 3.8 million people in its metropolitan area. Oviedo describes the rivers as abundant with fish of all sorts and home to communities of manatees that the indigenous population hunted sustainably, according to archaeological studies of the middens of the area. The waters were praised for their purity and fresh taste, especially that of waterfalls feeding into the river, which, as it neared the sea, became too contaminated with seawater for drinking. The banks were lined with a broad variety of fruit trees and the frequent songs of birds and the harsher tone of parrots. Oviedo notes the transition of grasses that are characteristic of ecotones, as well as the gradual transformation of fresh into seawater and the techniques of the indigenous population for hunting manatees, a familiarity that suggests a transitional period of co-inhabiting the land. The Spanish settlers had explored both the Isabela and Ozama rivers and their tributaries and had noted the intricate water network and its use by communities inland to bring produce to the settlements near the port area in exchange for fish, manatees, and other coastal sources of protein. They also noted frequent crossings between the east and west bank of the rivers that suggested an early form of water taxi. 500 years later, I turned to the work of a young Dominican painter, Serra Ies Polanco, barely 23, to gauge the fate of this first successful European settlement in the New World. In her work, If I Live Here, I Will Die, from 2018, a four-part politic that won Polanco the prestigious Eduardo Leon Jimenez Prize, she explores the lives of the slum communities that have developed along the banks of the Ozama since the 1960s, the communities where she grew up and still lives, and which she describes, and I quote, as neighborhoods that have grown on the banks of the Ozama River, along the canyons and the rugged topography prone to landslides. These landscapes, mainly made up of a variety of houses built very close to each other, caused me a certain anguish at the thought of a storm or a hurricane. The main function of a home, to provide shelter to its inhabitants in these neighborhoods, is not necessarily fulfilled. The roofs are damaged and tied with wires to the slats of the houses, then covered up with a tarp held by a few blocks just in case it rains in a tropical country. My experience has led me to think of homes as the chief reflection of our human condition. End of quote. Polanco's work speaks to us of the radical transformation undergone by the land between the Ozama and Isabella rivers as it faced what environmental historian Eleanor Melville has called an ecological revolution, an abrupt and qualitative break with the process of environmental and social change that had developed in situ. This was the meaning of colonization for these areas. The banks of the Ozama River constitute an ecotonal area marking the boundary between the river and the Caribbean Sea, a boundary quickly transformed by rapid environmental and social changes, some of them devastating to the biological and human communities that had thrived in place before the arrival of European settlers. Today, it is home to deeply endangered communities of the poor, threatened by the increasing impacts of climate change. The city faces the same climate-related quandaries of other cities in the region, like San Juan in Puerto Rico and Kingston in Jamaica. They have coastal location of essential infrastructure, airports, thermoelectric plants, major highways, rapidly deteriorating reef systems, increasingly vulnerable to bleaching events caused by rising sea temperatures, coastal erosion threatening vital tourism infrastructure, significant concentrations of people of lower socioeconomic status living in floodplains, threats to freshwater availability and quality, and high risk of food insecurity. But for the roughly 400,000 people living precariously along the banks of the Ozama River, their proximity to the river and its port increases their vulnerability. These are Santo Domingo's poorest, most marginalized populations, pushed by rapid urbanization to the most vulnerable riverside land, where they live in substandard housing in overcrowded neighborhoods. Persistent flooding threatens lives and property and brings residents into dangerous contact with the river's highly polluted waters, bearing harmful bacteria from raw sewage and toxic concentrations of metals like thallium from untreated industrial runoff, which drastically impacts local wildlife and quality of life and health for local human communities. The bed of the Ozama, moreover, is below sea level, so as tidal flooding and coastal erosion from storm surges grow even stronger due to climate change, the sea penetrates deep into the Ozama's watershed, its saltwater infiltration adding to the population's vulnerability to flooding and further contaminating the already deeply compromised freshwater supply. The Dominican poor living along the Ozama are considered by the World Bank to be among the world's most endangered people. The cities of the Caribbean, Santo Domingo perhaps most prominently given its size and geography, face significant climate change impacts in the coming decades, particularly from rising sea levels. The region's coastlines, as Brian Fagan argues for island chains around the world in his book The Attacking Ocean, find themselves acutely vulnerable to the ocean and its whims in ways unimaginable even 1 or 2 centuries ago, and are facing chronic issues like coastal erosion and persistent flooding, not as an abstract problem for the future, but as a sobering reality. In its Dominican Republic Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment Report of 2013, USAID concluded, and I quote, that many of the communities most susceptible to flooding are newly established temporary settlements of recent migrants to the city, people with limited economic means and access. NGOs, they assert, are helping them meet their needs, including improved community organization and representation, assistance with received basic services, and improving livelihood options. End of quote. Moreover, as Rafael Osiris de Leon concludes in his report on urban waters in the Dominican Republic, the flow of urban waters in Santo Domingo is becoming increasingly reduced by climate change induced drought and contaminated by direct discharges from inhabitants who lack basic sanitation and untreated discharges from industries near rivers and streams, which paints a worrying picture for the present and future of urban water in Santo Domingo. Benjamin Petit, a photographer chronicling the community of La Barquita as it faced leaving its riverbank emplacement, argues that, and I quote, while it emits only 0.06% of global greenhouse gases, the Dominican Republic is nevertheless suffering the dramatic consequence of the worldwide increase. In the past 50 years, 248 disastrous climate events such as hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, and droughts have hit the Caribbean alone. leaving populations like those living along the Ozama in a heightened state of vulnerability. End quote. The level of resilience of Santo Domingo's riverside population, that is, the magnitude of shock the system can absorb and remain within a given state, the degree to which the system is capable of self-organization, and the degree to which the system can build capacity for learning and adaptation is low, and how they fare in coming environmental crises will ultimately depend on the responses they elicit from different governmental and civil society institutions. Their plight can serve as a point of entry into a discussion of the limits of our quest for environmental equality under current regional legislation and market forces, and can highlight the role of writers, artists, and scholars in addressing climate change and environmental justice concerns that have often been ignored or neglected by government. Now, the deterioration of the Ozama represents the most radical transformation the city of Santo Domingo has undergone throughout the centuries, but most specifically in the 20th century. Dominican writer Jose Alcántara Almanzar's fiction has chronicled Santo Domingo's change from what he called a small, clean, tree-covered silent city divided by an Ozama River not yet turned into modern death, end of quote, to its present condition. Jose Morvan, like Polanco, a very young artist, recently completed a series that geometrically envisions Santo Domingo's coastal landscapes, as we see in this marine landscape from 2016, where the sea becomes a very dark zone of forest greens and deepest blues, forming a threatening block between land and sky. Or in this landscape number 3, where Santo Domingo's threatened coast is silhouetted against a crushing sky and a seemingly rising sea, insignificant against nature. Now, Morvan, in his series Dominican Dreams, pointedly dates his painting of the river, Ozama 1910, placing the peaceful portraits of peasants unloading their produce from their small boats in the realm of what he calls Dominicans, quote, penchant for nostalgia and the sterilization of our history, end of quote. The painting is based on a 1910 black and white photograph, and Morvan's own assessment of the painting underscores his notion that, and I quote, black and white are universal. Peoples have come to recognize their history through black and white photography, conferring onto them a historical worth that legitimizes them. The muted palette helps to build a better narrative that illustrates the temporal distance of the original reference and adds a new dimension to the piece, end of quote. Ozama 1910 captures the river's commercial activity when it still represented a reasonably unpolluted contact zone between rural and urban areas. Yet this commercial activity is already linked in the original photo to deforestation, as it depicted peasants unloading their cargoes of charcoal and guava. This is the bark of the Hispaniola pine, the Pinus occidentalis, whose long-burning bark had been used as kindling and for torches since pre-Columbian times. A second painting in the series, Puebla, circa 1945, was created against the background of a 2018 report that the once popular beach, an iconic place of leisure along the famous Santo Domingo Malecon, is now covered in plastic and other solid waste carried by the currents from the mouth of the Ozama River. The Lost Beach, as the Dominican press has labeled it, is contaminated with very high levels of raw sewage and heavy metals. The beach made news a year ago when it was transformed by a storm into what the Smithsonian Magazine called, and I quote, a nightmarish scene with garbage-filled waves depositing literal tons of refuse onto the sand as a dense garbage carpet, end of quote. Cleanup required more than 500 public workers, as well as the Navy and Army, to remove 30 tons of plastic bottles and styrofoam containers coming from the Ozama River, where river communities lacking the most basic sanitary facilities deposit about 90,000 tons of plastic debris per year. Dominican artists like Tony Capellan, similarly concerned with notions of invasion of the sea through the proliferation of local plastic debris in the Dominican Republic, focusing, however, on the narratives embodied in plastic objects that they saw as evidence of the loss and sorrow of poverty and economic marginalization. The focus of Capellan's installation, as you see here in Mar Caribe, was the debris he had recovered from the beaches of the capital city of Santo Domingo, especially from those near the mouth of the Ozama River. The objects Capellan collected and arranged into what he called stories, metaphors, visions, were those washed away by floodwaters from these endangered people's homes into the Caribbean Sea, where the currents returned them to its shore at high tide, his gift to the artist. They first claimed Capellan's attention because they were not the kinds of objects you would put in a plastic trash bag, but useful objects dragged away by the floods, perhaps beloved objects whose loss could be felt, of objects perhaps missed, mourned. Through their incorporation into Capellan's installation, these eloquent materials became, in his words, visions about the reality of these people, but also visions that encompass many countries, many situations similar to those of the Dominican Republic in the same geographical area. End of quote. For Capellan, the proliferation of plastic debris on the beaches of Santo Domingo spoke as eloquently to the viewer about environmental pollution as about the environmental vulnerability of a population that has been doubly displaced. He described the flip-flops that make up Mar Caribe, as you see here, as encompassing the stories of those who used to wear them. And I quote from him, farmers without land who migrated to the city where everything had been taken from them and sealed off by barbed wire, end of quote. And who live now at the mercy of a river and a sea that invade their makeshift dwellings at will, taking away meager possessions and needed everyday implements, combs, buckets, cups, plates, toys. As Elizabeth D'Onofrio has written about Capellan's Mar Invadido, and I quote, we may interpret Capellan's installations in terms of creating not a colonial archive, but rather a site of witnessing, rendering the secret of wasted lives visible to the more privileged classes who benefit from both the labor and sacrifices made by the undifferentiated poor, end of quote. The works of artists like Polanco, Capellan, and Morvan, working in conjunction with local and foreign NGOs, has led to some concerted action along the banks of the Ozama in the last 10 years. In Ozama River neighborhoods like La Barquita and Huachupita, which you see pictured here, these efforts have led to some incipient climate adaptation projects aimed to relocate the neighborhood's most vulnerable families to higher ground. La Barquita, as well as Huachupita, are a maze of metal shacks that cascades down a hillside to the river's floodplain. Residents have built homes all the way to the edge of the river. La Barquita's Neighborhood Association, which has organized, among other things, systems of flood alert and refuge at higher grounds for those having to leave their homes in a flood emergency, is characteristic of the solidarity that has led to plans to create a Nueva Barquita, a new Barquita, a new neighborhood away from the water that will include several apartment buildings, a high school, clinic, church, and shopping strip. Benjamin Petit, a French photographer, in his climate refugee photography project in La Barquita, began as an assignment for the French Development Agency to portray the resettlement of a riverside slum community into housing project. Laurence Cornet, writing about the resettlement, points to how Petit's series documents both sides of the river, from the semi-ruins of La Barquita, when the community was still living there, to the brick towers of La Nueva Barquita after they moved in. Parallels and contrasts arise from such a juxtaposition, offering a nuanced perspective on assisted displacement. Moving into their dry, concrete home will spare this community's yearly devastating floods, Cornet writes, but it also means renouncing their lifestyle. In La Barquita, as their previous barrio will be remembered after its imminent destruction, families had a rural life. They had to keep their foot or hand on the ground while sleeping to check the rising waters, but children were spending days by the river and men were gathering on the occasions of tense traditional cockfights. Abdelaila Hamdouche and Andiel Galvan, in an in-depth analysis of the development of the new Barquita community as a model for future interventions, point, and I quote, to a missed opportunity to create institutional and technical capacities among relevant actors for similar future projects, in a project that could have been the opportunity for more transformative outcomes in terms of participation and empowerment. Santo Domingo's government, mired in its inadequate response to always lurking political crisis, has been woefully slow in responding to recommendations for climate change adaptation, a lack of preparation glaringly evident to the communities along the Ozama. Artists and writers, in their turn, have focused on the aquatic nature of the city of Santo Domingo, the aquatic nation that first attracted conquistadors to its colonization in the 16th century, whose infrastructure of fluid communication underscores the ubiquity of water as the city's most important environmental element. The written and painted chronicles of the city's signature river call attention to the transformation of areas of swamp, mangroves, marshes, wetlands into working and lower middle class neighborhoods, those most threatened now as they are at or slightly below sea level. They offer us a glimpse into acute urban vulnerabilities that will make climate change the most challenging task for the Dominican capital and, in fact, for the Caribbean region as a whole. So thank you for joining me. I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions, I would love to hear from you. I love to hear from students and alums. So thank you very, very much.